Have you ever had a moment where everything you thought was true turned out to be a carefully constructed lie? Picture this. You're pregnant. Your billionaire husband promises he's changed. Your best friend swears she's got your back. The investigators say you're just a victim. And then you realize all four of them are lying. Grace Whitmore's life didn't fall apart slowly. It detonated in one brutal night when she discovered her husband's affair, her forged signature on federal documents, and a conspiracy that stretched from Manhattan boardrooms to offshore accounts she never knew existed. But here's the twist. Grace didn't break. She became unbreakable. This is 90 minutes of pure adrenaline, betrayal, gaslighting, corporate warfare, and a pregnant woman who decided she was done being everyone's pawn. Before we dive in, do me a favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear a story about fighting back, and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Because what Grace does next, you have to hear it to believe it. Now, let's watch her world burn and rise from the ashes. Have you ever had that strange feeling like something in your life is about to change forever, but you can't explain why? Well, tonight I'm going to tell you a story that begins exactly with that moment. A story that starts out ordinary, until one small, quiet detail turns everything upside down. Someone thought they were safe. Someone thought they were loved. Someone thought they knew the truth. But what they discovered next? Let's just say it was the kind of revelation that could burn an entire life to the ground. And trust me, once you hear what happened, you'll understand why this story is impossible to stop in the middle. So take a breath, settle in, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after it ends. And hey, if you love stories that pull you in, twist your emotions, and keep you guessing until the very last second, don't forget to like, drop a comment, share this video, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Grace Whitmore always believed that the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Gala felt more like a stage than a charity venue. The ceiling glittered with chandeliers, the kind you only see in old Manhattan hotels or in the homes of people who use the word legacy far too often. She had attended this gala every year since marrying Ethan Whitmore. But tonight she stood at the center of the room not as a hostess, not as a supportive wife, but as a woman seconds away from detonating her entire life. The moment she tapped her champagne glass, a delicate ping rose above the chatter of 300 guests. It carried across the room and into the spine of every person who recognized that sound. Conversations quieted. Even the string quartet in the corner dimmed their volume without being asked. Grace felt her pulse slow, like her body had accepted that she was about to jump off a cliff and had decided to enjoy the view on the way down. But before we reach the moment where Grace announces the end of her marriage, we need to understand how she got here. And to understand that, we go back several months to a different stage entirely. 1 month earlier, Grace Whitmore was 32 years old, a lifestyle coach with a growing social media presence and a reputation for being the calmest person in the room. She carried something like sunshine with her. People said she had the kind of energy that made you feel like things might turn out all right, even if your whole world was on fire. That was her gift, her brand, her livelihood. Her husband, Ethan Whitmore, was 38, founder and CEO of Whitmore Financial Systems, a fintech giant valued in the billions. He had charm in the way a polished coin has shine. Brilliant, confident, intoxicating if you didn't stare too long at the edges where the scratches lived. Their penthouse sat on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, floor-to-ceiling windows, a terrace overlooking the Hudson River. Rooms so large the silence sometimes echoed. Grace loved the views. Ethan loved the status. It worked for a while. But in the weeks before the gala, Grace sensed something else lurking behind Ethan's controlled smile. Late-night meetings. A new second phone he claimed was for compliance. Sudden trips to Boston, Chicago, Miami. Excuses stacked like dominoes. And when she gently asked if something was wrong, Ethan would pull her into a hug and whisper, "Everything is fine. You worry too much." Grace wanted to believe him, because the truth was, she didn't want her marriage to break. Not after everything she and Ethan had built together. Not after the struggles that shaped them. She remembered when Ethan was just a brilliant programmer in a tiny apartment, dreaming big while eating boxed macaroni. She remembered choosing love over comfort, ambition over stability. But one night, something happened that Grace could not ignore. Grace returned home from a client workshop earlier than expected. The penthouse was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She set her keys down and walked toward the bedroom. That was when she saw a glow coming from underneath the door of Ethan's office. Grace. Ethan, are you home? No answer. She pushed the door open slightly. Ethan wasn't there, but his laptop screen flickered with a paused video. Grace stepped closer. The thumbnail made her heart flicker with unease. A blonde woman in a sleek black dress stepping into a private jet, her face half turned toward the camera, smiling. Grace froze. The woman was no one she recognized. And the footage? It looked like someone had recorded it secretly, like paparazzi video. Ethan never followed influencers or celebrities. He wasn't the type to watch random footage of glamorous women. Something about the moment felt off, almost staged. Before she could look deeper, Ethan walked into the apartment. Ethan, oh, hey, you're home early. He sounded surprised, too surprised. Grace minimized the video, pretending she hadn't seen anything. She asked about his day. He told her about meetings. They made dinner together. They watched a show. It was ordinary, almost painfully ordinary. But the unease didn't leave her chest. Grace found herself replaying that moment over and over like a splinter she couldn't pull out. Maybe it was harmless. Maybe it was nothing. But deep inside, her intuition whispered something she didn't dare speak out loud. And then, 2 days later, came the first real crack. Grace finished a coaching session with a client when her phone buzzed with a message from her neighbor, Patrick Hines. He lived in the building next door and flew photography drones for fun. Patrick, hey Grace, random question. Do you want footage of your terrace? The drone picked up some stuff last night. I can delete if you want privacy. Grace frowned. Why would he record her terrace? She typed back politely. Grace, sure, send it, just curious. The video arrived a minute later. Grainy night vision footage. Her terrace, the glass railings, 2 silhouettes. Grace leaned closer. One of the figures was undeniably Ethan, and the other was the blonde woman from the video on Ethan's laptop. This time, she wasn't stepping into a jet. She was stepping toward Ethan, and Ethan was kissing her like he had no wife in the world. Grace felt her throat close. Her chest tightened. It was like the floor fell out from beneath her. Her voice trembled as she whispered into the empty room, Grace, no, this can't be real. This was only the first catastrophe, and Grace had no idea that 2 even bigger ones were coming. She had no idea that her public life, her marriage, and her identity were about to implode. But this was the moment the clock started ticking, and it was ticking fast. Grace sat in her studio, the lights off, the only glow coming from her phone screen. She replayed the drone video again, and again, and again. Each time, she hoped the shapes would rearrange themselves into something innocent. 2 neighbors, a client, anyone but her billionaire husband, and a woman she did not know. But the way Ethan leaned in, the way his hand cupped the back of the blonde woman's neck, that was not the hug of a colleague. That was a man who was not worried about being seen. That was a husband who had begun to live as if he were single. Grace whispered to herself, Grace, you coach women on self-respect. You tell them to listen to their intuition. What are you going to do now, Grace? It is an awful thing when your own advice comes back to test you. That is one of those universal dilemmas. Is it better to know the truth and have your life fall apart, or to stay in the dark and protect the illusion that keeps you functioning? Most people think they know their answer, until it is their turn. Grace watched the video one last time, then forced herself to stop. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and headed home. The elevator doors opened onto the private foyer of the Whitmore penthouse. Grace stepped out, her pulse drumming in her ears. She could smell Ethan's cologne before she even saw him. Warm, expensive, familiar. It almost made her want to pretend nothing had changed. Ethan was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, pouring a glass of wine. Ethan, hey, there you are. I was just about to text you. Long day? He smiled, the easy practice grin that had charmed investors, journalists, and more than a few strangers. For the first time in years, the sight of that smile made her stomach clench with something close to fear. Grace set her bag down slowly. Grace, yeah, long day. She studied him, the billionaire husband, the man she had defended at dinner parties, on podcasts, in interviews. Every time someone made a joke about rich guys and their wandering eyes, she had always insisted Ethan was different. Now she was not so sure. Grace, we need to talk. Those 4 words have ended more relationships than any affair ever has. Ethan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned. Ethan, "Oh, okay, that sounds serious. What is going on?" She could have eased in. She could have asked vague questions, but something inside her was tired of walking on emotional eggshells. Grace, I saw a video, drone footage, of our terrace from a neighbor. It was you. And a woman, a blonde woman at night. The wine glass paused halfway to Ethan's lips. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. Ethan set the glass down carefully. Ethan, Grace, listen. That is not what you think. There it was, the oldest sentence in the book. Grace's voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. Grace, what is it then? Ethan sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and leaned against the counter. Ethan, her name is Lauren. She is a consultant for one of our international funds. We had a confidential call that could not happen over Zoom. And yes, she came up to talk. I should have told you. The drone angle probably makes it look worse than it was. Grace stared at him. She knew what she had seen. She had seen his hand in the woman's hair. She had seen the kiss. But in that moment, as he spoke, he layered his explanation with just enough detail to make a sliver of doubt creep into her mind. Ethan continued. Ethan, I swear to you, Grace, there is nothing going on. You know how these things are. Any photo, any video, and suddenly the internet thinks the billionaire husband is cheating on his pregnant wife for clicks. He even laughed gently, like the idea was absurd. The sound scraped against her nerves. Grace, I am not the internet, Ethan. I know what a kiss looks like. The words landed between them like glass shattering. Ethan's mask cracked. Just a little. He looked away. Ethan, okay, I crossed a line. It was a stupid, impulsive moment. I was drunk, I was stressed. I felt like I was carrying the whole world on my shoulders, and someone paid attention to me in a way that was different. It was a kiss. That is all. One stupid kiss. It did not mean anything. And there it was again, another classic line. It did not mean anything. For a second, Grace almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Even her billionaire husband, with all his brilliance, had resorted to the most basic script. Grace, you kissed her here, on our terrace, where I do my morning meditations, where we had our anniversary dinner. He winced. Ethan, I know, and I hate myself for it. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you. I did not want to lose you over a mistake. His voice broke on the last word. A small part of her, the part that remembered late-night ramen and shared dreams, still loved him. That was the problem. It is hard to burn down a house you built with your own hands. Grace's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Grace, I do not even know what to feel right now. Ethan stepped closer, but stopped a few feet away, as if he knew there was an invisible line he should not cross. Ethan, please, let me fix this. We can go away, just you and me. No work, no meetings. I will cancel everything. We will go to the Hamptons. We will reset. You tell women every day that relationships can survive hard things. Let us prove you right. It was manipulative, maybe, or maybe it was desperate, or maybe it was both. But in that moment, Grace faced a choice that thousands of people listening to this story have faced in their own way. Do you walk away at the first undeniable sign of betrayal? Or do you stay and try to salvage something from the wreckage? Because the history you share feels heavier than the pain you are holding. This was the first subtle engagement point, even if Grace did not know it. Because anyone who has ever loved someone flawed, which is to say everyone, knows that love does not come with clear instructions. Grace spoke quietly. Grace, if we try, it is not for your image, or for your company, or for your investors. If we try, it is because I still believe there is something real under all of this. And if you ever do something like that again, Ethan, I will walk out and I will not look back. Ethan nodded quickly. Ethan, you will not have to. I promise. I will talk to Lauren. I will cut contact. Done. I will prove to you that you and our family are the only thing that matters. He said it with conviction. He said it like a man closing a deal. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, and for a moment, Grace allowed herself to sink into the embrace. This was her first false sense of safety. She thought, maybe this is the turning point. Maybe this is where we do the work, where my billionaire husband proves he can be faithful, where I show up like the woman I tell my clients to be. Strong, boundaried, compassionate. That night, they booked the Hamptons house. They planned a weekend away. Ethan sent emails canceling meetings. He even left his second phone on the kitchen counter, like a trophy of transparency. And for a brief, fragile window of time, Grace allowed herself to believe that the worst might be over. In the days that followed, she went back to her routine. Coaching sessions, content planning, prenatal checkups. She spoke gently to the baby growing inside her, promising a life filled with love, even if she did not yet know what shape that love would take. Between calls, she jotted down a note for her clients and, without meaning to, for herself. Grace softly to herself as she wrote, actionable advice, step 1. When you feel betrayed, do not rush a decision from the highest point of your pain. Step 2, get quiet enough to hear your own voice beneath the noise of fear and anger. Step 3, if you choose to stay, stay with clear boundaries. If you choose to leave, leave with your self-respect. She smiled sadly at the notebook. It would make a good podcast episode someday. Maybe, if she survived this. But while Grace was trying to heal, something else was gathering momentum in the background. Numbers were being moved, papers were being signed, and decisions were being made with her name on them. The pregnant wife thought she had just survived the worst storm of her marriage. She did not know that catastrophe number 2 was already on its way. And this time, it would not just threaten her heart, it would threaten her freedom. Grace Whitmore believed she had survived the storm, not the whole storm, but at least the first violent wave. After the confrontation with Ethan on the terrace incident, the house felt calmer, softer, almost like it remembered how to breathe again. Ethan was more present, more affectionate, more attentive. He cooked her breakfast, brought her tea, asked about her clients, brushed her hair behind her ear like he used to in the early years. For the first time in weeks, Grace woke up without the sense that her life was waiting to ambush her. That false sense of safety would not last long. Well, catastrophe number 2 would hit harder. Because betrayal of the heart hurts deeply, but betrayal of trust, real, tangible, legal trust, can shatter you in ways you cannot even name. 1 week after the Hamptons conversation, Grace attended her second trimester ultrasound. She sat in the clinic lobby, humming softly to her unborn daughter. The screensaver on her phone showed a sonogram, a tiny shape floating in black and white, proof of a future she was determined to protect. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A businesslike tone. A woman's voice. Woman. Hello, is this Mrs. Grace Whitmore? Grace. Ibistis. Yes, this is she, my name is attorney Karen Doyle. I represent several clients in a preliminary investigation involving Whitmore Financial Systems. I would like to speak with you regarding several documents filed under your name. Grace blinked. Grace, I think you have the wrong person. I do not file business documents. My husband handles everything. Attorney Doyle, calm and unwavering. Mrs. Whitmore, your signature appears on 5 corporate creation forms, dated within the last 4 months. These entities are now being reviewed for potential tax discrepancies, including offshore fund transfers. Grace's mouth went dry. Grace, I did not sign anything like that. I do not even know what those forms are. Attorney, then I strongly advise you to come to my office as soon as possible. Grace stood slowly, her vision blurring at the edges. Her first thought was of Ethan. Her second thought was of the baby. Her third was a clean, sharp disbelief that threatened to snap her in half. She whispered into the phone, Grace, are you saying I am under investigation? Attorney Doyle, not yet, but your name is on documents tied to large financial discrepancies. We need to determine how your signature got there. The call ended. Grace sat frozen, staring at her phone. A new number appeared on screen. Unknown caller. Grace hesitated, then answered. The voice that came through was smooth, cultured, and laced with something that felt like silk wrapped around a knife. Woman, Grace Whitmore, finally, I've been wanting to speak with you for quite some time. Grace, who is this? The woman laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of ice. Woman, my name is Victoria Harlow. I sit on your husband's board, and I'm afraid we have some rather urgent matters to discuss. Matters concerning your, shall we say, precarious legal situation. Grace's pulse quickened. Grace, what do you want? Victoria, oh, darling, it's not about what I want. It's about what you're going to lose if you don't start being a bit more cooperative. Grace felt her stomach turn. Grace, are you threatening me? Victoria's tone sharpened, just slightly. Victoria, threatening you? Sweetheart, I don't threaten. I simply inform. And right now, I'm informing you that your signature appears on documents that could send you to federal prison. Documents that suggest you helped your husband commit fraud. Now, whether those signatures are real or not, well, that depends on how helpful you choose to be. Grace's hand shook. Grace, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't sign anything. Victoria sighed, theatrical and patronizing. Victoria, of course you didn't. Poor Grace, always so trusting, so naive. That's what happens when you marry someone out of your league, I suppose. You never quite understand the game being played. Grace's voice hardened. Grace, what do you want from me? Victoria, simple. Meet me, tomorrow, 2 p.m., the Carlisle Hotel bar. Come alone. We'll have a civilized conversation about your future, or lack thereof. Grace, and if I don't, Victoria's voice dropped to something colder than winter. Victoria, then I'll make sure every news outlet in America knows that Grace Whitmore, the sweet little lifestyle coach, helped her billionaire husband steal millions from his own company. And when the FBI comes knocking, well, darling, I'll make sure they find exactly what they need to lock you away. The line went dead. Grace sat in the clinic parking lot, the ultrasound photo still clutched in her hand, and felt the full weight of catastrophe number 2 settle onto her shoulders. She wasn't just losing her marriage, she was losing her freedom. And somewhere in Manhattan, a woman who had waited 10 years for revenge was smiling. The call ended. Grace sank into a chair in the clinic waiting room, her heartbeat loud and unsteady. Grace to herself, no, Ethan would never. He would never drag me into something illegal. Not him, not us, not with the baby. But doubt, once invited, has a way of unpacking itself and settling in. Grace paced the living room until Ethan arrived, dropping his briefcase and walking toward her with concern etched across his face. Ethan. Grace, what happened? You look pale. Grace, I got a call from a lawyer. She said I signed documents for shell companies under investigation. My name, my signature. Ethan went still, like a statue in a windstorm. Grace continued, voice cracking. Grace, tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you did not use my name. Tell me you did not forge my signature. Ethan swallowed hard. Ethan. Grace, you have to understand. It is complicated. Grace stepping back. Complicated? Ethan, am I at risk of being arrested? He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Ethan, listen, I needed temporary holding companies for an overseas acquisition. Using my name would have sent up flags. I planned to dissolve them as soon as the deal was done. It is common practice. You were never in danger. Grace, you forged my name. Ethan, I used your electronic signature. You gave me permissions for that years ago when we set up our joint trust. I did not think you would mind. Grace, come on, it was harmless. Harmless. The word echoed like a cruel joke. Grace stared at him, feeling a cold fist tightening around her lungs. Grace, you put me in the middle of a federal investigation. Ethan, it is not federal yet. It is just a routine audit. And once I fix the paperwork, your name will be cleared. Grace, you had no right. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. Ethan, Grace, you are overreacting. I did what I had to do to protect a multi-billion-dollar deal. Everything will be fine. If the drone footage was heartbreak, this was annihilation. One betrayal attacks your heart. The next one attacks your reality, Grace whispered. Grace, you promised me no more lies. Ethan, I am telling you the truth now. Grace, only because you were caught. This was her second major breaking point, the kind that does not just bruise your trust. It fractures your identity. She felt like the floor had shifted under her feet again, the universe rearranging in a way she could not control. Narrator continues. Some betrayals arrive like thunder, others like paperwork. Grace stepped away from him, shaking her head. Grace, I need air. Ethan, Grace, do not walk out. You are pregnant. Let me fix this. Grace, I cannot breathe in here. She grabbed her coat and left the penthouse. Outside, the cold Manhattan air felt like a slap. The city roared with its usual indifference. Yellow cabs, shouting vendors, the river wind cutting through her coat. Grace walked without direction, her breath turning to fog, her mind spinning. This was engagement moment number 2, because almost everyone has been betrayed by someone they trusted too deeply, someone they believed would protect them. For Grace, it was her husband. For others, a parent, a friend, a partner, a mentor. The shock is universal. The aftermath, too. Grace found herself in Riverside Park, sitting on a bench, staring at the Hudson River. She murmured, Grace, actionable advice. Step 1. When someone shows you they are willing to sacrifice your safety for their gain, do not ignore it. Step 2. Trust broken at this level cannot be repaired with words, only with accountability. She let the silence stretch. For the first time, she wondered if her marriage could survive this. Then her phone buzzed again. A text message from an unknown number. Message, you should check Ethan's Chicago trip. He was not alone. Grace felt her stomach drop. Her throat tightened. No name, no explanation, just a photo attached. She tapped it with trembling fingers. The image opened. It showed Ethan, unmistakably Ethan, entering a hotel in Chicago, his hand on the waist of the same blonde woman from the drone footage. Grace whispered, Grace. No, no, no. Her voice cracked on the last word. And just like that, the second catastrophe bled into the third. Grace had not even processed the financial betrayal when the emotional one tore through her life again, sharper than before. She curled over on the park bench, hands on her stomach, whispering to the baby, Grace, I am so sorry. I am trying. I am trying so hard. 3 catastrophes, betrayal, fraud, and now a second affair, were converging faster than she could stand. Grace stood up slowly, wiped her tears, and whispered to herself, Grace, this is not over, but I will not let this destroy me. She did not know it yet, but her worst heartbreak was still coming. Grace Whitmore returned to the penthouse that evening with a resolve she did not recognize in herself. Not anger, not despair, something heavier, something forged in the clash between heartbreak and survival. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and found Ethan sitting on the sofa, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He looked up the second she entered. Ethan, Grace, I've been calling you. You scared me. Are you all right? She did not answer. She simply walked past him, hung her coat, and placed her phone on the marble counter. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if controlling her breath was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Ethan stood. Ethan, please talk to me. Grace finally turned to him. Grace, who is she? Ethan blinked. Ethan, who is who? Grace, the woman from Chicago. Color drained from Ethan's face. Real fear flickered in his eyes. He opened his mouth, then closed it again like the sentence he needed did not exist. Ethan, Grace, I do not know what you think you saw. Grace cut him off sharply. Grace, I know exactly what I saw. Third time is not an accident. It is a pattern. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice softened. Ethan, it is not what you think. She works for one of our partner funds. She needed, Grace, your hand on her waist? Really? That is part of the partnership agreement? Ethan's jaw tightened, frustration cracking through the softness. Ethan, you are being dramatic. Grace, I am under unbelievable pressure. I am running a multi-billion-dollar company. I am trying to protect our future. And yes, sometimes I connect with people because they understand what I am carrying. Grace stared at him. Grace, you connected with her on our terrace, On our weekend trips in Chicago, how many more? Ethan stepped forward, but she raised a hand, stopping him in place. Grace whispered, Grace, you said you would prove I was your priority. Ethan, and I meant it. Grace, then why am I living in a house full of lies? Ethan groaned, raking both hands through his hair. Ethan, Grace, listen to me. I did not sleep with her. Grace, you do not get points for stopping before the finish line. Silence filled the room. If words were weapons, this one landed right in the center of his armor. Ethan looked like someone standing in the wreckage of a fire he had started, but could not control. Then something shifted behind his eyes. Not regret, not love, something darker. A flash of fear. Ethan, there is something I need to tell you, but you need to promise me to stay calm. Grace's stomach dropped. Grace, no more secrets. Tell me everything. Ethan paced the length of the living room, stopping near the window. City lights glittered behind him, throwing long shadows across the floor. Ethan, the Chicago trip was not a trip with her. I mean, she was there, yes, but she was not the only one. Grace frowned. Grace, what does that mean? Ethan exhaled. Ethan, it means someone else was involved, someone who manipulated the situation, someone who wanted you to see those photos. Grace's voice tightened. Grace, who? Ethan hesitated. Ethan, Maddie. Grace froze. Grace, my best friend Maddie? Ethan nodded slowly. Ethan, she has been feeding you information for months, not just information. She's been feeding me information about you too. The room tilted. The air thinned. Grace's closest confidant, the woman she cried to, the friend who knew her fears, her doubts, her history. Ethan continued. Ethan, she recorded your therapy sessions. She forwarded your voice notes. She told the board you were unstable, emotional, unpredictable. She said you were planning to leave me and take half the company. Grace, that is insane. Maddie would never, Ethan, she was paid. Grace staggered back a step. Ethan, not by me, by someone on the board trying to undermine the company. They convinced her the only way to protect you was to help them gather information. She thought she was doing something good for you. Grace shook her head hard. Grace, no, Maddie would never betray me. She loves me. Ethan's voice softened. Ethan, she loves the idea of being important in your life. That is not the same thing. Grace's eyes filled with tears. This was not a knife to the heart. This was a fault line opening beneath her feet. She whispered, Grace, why are you telling me this now? Ethan lowered his gaze. Ethan, because they are using her to build a case against me, against us, against the company. And if you get pulled into this investigation, Grace, it will not just be me they go after. Grace stared at him. Grace, what investigation? Ethan closed his eyes. Ethan, there is more. You should know. Grace braced herself. But nothing could have prepared her for the final blow. Ethan, the woman from the terrace, from Chicago, from the photos, she is pregnant. Grace could not breathe. She forced out a whisper. Grace, no. Ethan, she is claiming it is mine. I do not believe her. But she is filing a legal notice. And if it becomes public... Grace, stop, stop. Her voice cracked, sharp as broken glass. Grace stumbled backward until her back hit the wall. Grace, you did this. You put your hands on her. You built this mess. You pulled me into illegal documents. You let Maddie betray me. And now you are telling me she might be carrying your child? Ethan reached toward her, desperation in his eyes. Ethan, Grace, I swear I will fix this. I will take a test. I will sue her if she lies. I will make everything right. Please. Grace, you cannot fix this. You broke everything. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Grace, my son, I cannot do this anymore. Ethan stepped back, his expression collapsing into genuine fear. Ethan, Grace, I love you. Grace looked at him with hollow eyes. Grace, then you should have acted like it. And with that single sentence, something inside Grace finally snapped. Not in anger, not in panic, but in clarity. She walked past Ethan, grabbed her coat, and headed toward the elevator. Ethan rushed after her. Ethan, Grace, stop. Where are you going? Grace, to save myself before there is nothing left to save. The elevator doors closed between them. Ethan's hands slammed against the glass, but Grace did not flinch. For the first time, she felt something close to peace. Not safety, not healing, but the first step away from the man who had set her world on fire. She whispered to herself in the elevator, Grace, you are not powerless. You are not trapped. You are not done. But the universe was not finished testing her, because catastrophe number 3 had not fully detonated yet. And when it did, it would force Grace to confront something she had never prepared for. What happens when the truth is worse than the lies? Grace Whitmore walked out of the penthouse tower and straight into the cold New York night, the sharp wind cutting against her skin like a warning. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, but no fabric could soften the truth she was now carrying. Her best friend had betrayed her. Her husband had detonated their life, and a stranger claimed she was pregnant with Ethan's child. This was catastrophe number 3, and it had arrived with merciless precision. Grace whispered to herself, Grace, do not fall apart. Not here. Not now. She stepped into a taxi, gave the driver an address she had not visited in years, and sank into the seat. City lights streaked past her window like blurred memories, each one echoing a version of her life she no longer recognized. Phone buzzing. Grace ignored it. Ethan's name lit the screen again and again. Driver, rough night, miss. Grace forced a thin smile. Grace, you have no idea. Driver chuckled softly. Driver, people only ride this late for 2 reasons. Running towards something or running away. Grace exhaled shakily. For a brief, absurd moment, she appreciated the accidental wisdom from a man she'd never met. Grace, maybe both. He nodded knowingly. It was the first time that night she didn't feel completely alone. Scene change. Maddie's apartment. 20 minutes later, Grace stepped out in front of a brownstone building she had not visited since before her marriage. Maddie's place. Maddie, the woman who'd stood by her during breakups, career crises, and family drama. The woman Grace trusted more than anyone in the world. Or so she thought. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. Grace knocked. The door opened. Maddie appeared in leggings and an oversized sweater, her hair in a messy bun, holding a mug of chamomile tea. She looked harmless, familiar, safe. Maddie. Grace, oh my God, what happened? You look shaken. Grace stared at her, searching her face for guilt, fear, anything. But Maddie's expression was pure concern. Grace stepped inside without answering. Maddie closed the door behind her. Maddie, talk to me, please. Grace took a long breath. Grace, how long have you been forwarding my messages? Maddie froze, her fingers tightened around the mug. She looked at Grace as if someone had turned her into stone. Maddie. Grace, I can explain. Grace, so it is true. Maddie set the mug down, hands trembling. Maddie, it wasn't like that. I wasn't trying to hurt you. Grace's voice rose. Grace, you recorded my therapy sessions. Maddie winced. Maddie, I was told it was to help you, that you were overwhelmed, that Ethan's company needed to make sure you were stable with everything going on. They said, Grace, they who? Who are they? Maddie hesitated. Her eyes darted away. Grace stepped closer. Grace, Maddie, tell me. Maddie whispered. Maddie, the board. The ones trying to push Ethan out. For a moment, Grace froze. Not from shock, but from the chilling realization that she had walked straight into a war she didn't even know existed. Grace, so you helped them destroy my marriage, my trust, my privacy. Maddie shook her head desperately. Maddie, no, Grace. They told me you were in danger, that Ethan was hiding things from you, that you needed someone watching your back. Grace stared at her. Grace, and you believed them instead of me? Maddie's voice cracked. Maddie, I just wanted to protect you. Grace felt her knees weaken, not from betrayal itself, but from the cruel, unbearable irony. Grace, my mom, you protected me by destroying me. Maddie's silent tears fell. She reached for Grace, but Grace stepped back sharply. Grace, do not touch me. Maddie swallowed hard. Maddie, Grace, please don't walk out. Let me make this right. Grace, there is nothing left to make right. She walked toward the door. But just before leaving, she asked quietly, Grace, Maddie, the Chicago photos, were you involved? Maddie looked away, and that was all the answer Grace needed. Scene change. The street. Grace stepped out into the night, again shaking uncontrollably. She pressed a hand against a lamppost as nausea swept through her. It was too much, too fast, too cruel. The betrayal, the lies, the pregnancy claim, the board manipulating her life, her best friends selling her out. It was as if the universe had lined up every fault line in her world and jumped on it. Grace whispered, Grace, I cannot do this alone. Her phone buzzed again. This time the caller ID read unknown number. Grace hesitated, then answered, Grace. Hello? A deep voice responded. Voice, Mrs. Whitmore, this is Detective Harris with the Manhattan Financial Crimes Unit. We need to speak with you tonight. It is urgent. Grace's breath stopped. Grace, I think you have the wrong person. Detective Harris, no, we do not. It concerns your husband. Her heart began to pound. Detective Harris continued, Detective Harris, we have reason to believe you may be in possession of documents related to illegal transactions. We advise you do not destroy anything. A subpoena has been issued. Grace felt the world tilt violently. Grace, illegal? What? Detective Harris, we will explain when we arrive. Grace, when you arrive? Wait. Detective Harris, Mrs. Whitmore, we are already 2 minutes away. The line went dead. Grace stared at her phone, breath shallow, pulse racing out of control. This was the fourth disaster, the one she never saw coming, the one that confirmed her greatest fear. She wasn't just collateral damage. She was now a suspect. She whispered shakily, Grace, oh God, Ethan, what did you do? A police siren echoed in the distance, getting closer, closer, and closer. Grace stepped back toward the curb, clutching her coat, fighting the panic clawing at her chest. The taxi driver from earlier rolled by slowly and gave her a sympathetic nod, as if sensing the storm building behind her eyes. Grace whispered, Grace, running towards something, or running away. For the first time, she knew the answer. She was running for her life, and the real war was only beginning. Grace Whitmore stood frozen beneath the orange glow of the street lamp as the sirens grew louder, bouncing off the buildings like a countdown she could not stop. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Every disaster of the night converged into a single crushing realization. She was in danger. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally, tangibly, immediately. A black unmarked sedan rolled to the curb. Two figures stepped out. Detective Harris, a tall man in a charcoal coat, and Detective Lee, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Detective Harris lifted an ID badge. Detective Harris, Mrs. Whitmore, we need a few minutes of your time. Grace swallowed. Grace, I don't understand what this is about. Detective Lee, it's about your husband and certain documents we believe passed through your hands. Grace stiffened. Her mind flashed back to the stacks of papers Ethan had asked her to sign. The ones he had insisted were routine. The ones she never questioned because she trusted him. Grace, what kind of documents? Detective Harris hesitated. Detective Harris, ma'am, are you safe to talk right now? Grace blinked. Grace, safe? What does that mean? Detective Lee stepped closer. Detective Lee, Mrs. Whitmore, you're not under arrest, but you may be a target in an ongoing corporate manipulation scheme. We need to ask you some questions before anyone else reaches you. Grace's heartbeat stumbled. Grace, anyone else? Detective Harris, your husband's board has factions. Some want control of the company. Some want Ethan out. Some want leverage. You may be the key to all three. Grace looked between them, stunned. Grace, I just found out my best friend was spying on me, and now you're telling me strangers want to use me as leverage? For what? Detective Lee's eyes softened slightly. Detective Lee, money, power, and influence. The usual. Grace almost let out a broken laugh, a humorless, exhausted sound. Grace, is there anything in my life that wasn't a lie? Detective Harris, We don't think Ethan wants to hurt you, but other people might. You may have signed documents linking you to suspicious transfers. Grace stepped back in horror. Grace, wait, are you telling me you think I'm involved? Because I would never. Detective Harris raised a calm hand. Detective Harris, we're not accusing you. We're warning you. Your signature might be on files connected to an offshore shell corporation. Grace felt her stomach plunge. She whispered, barely audible. Grace, he said they were for privacy protection, estate planning, something about consolidating assets. Detective Lee sighed. Detective Lee, that's how most of these cases start. Grace pressed a hand over trembling lips. Her life wasn't simply unraveling. It was being pulled apart fiber by fiber. Detective Harris looked at her with firm urgency. Detective Harris, Mrs. Whitmore, did you bring any of those documents with you? Grace shook her head quickly. Grace, no, I don't have anything. Detective Lee exchanged a look with Harris. Detective Lee, then we need to take you somewhere safer while we figure out who else might have access. Grace startled. Grace, you're taking me with you? Detective Harris, we strongly advise it. A gust of cold wind sliced between them, rustling Grace's coat. She shivered. Her body felt foreign, her thoughts scrambled. She wanted to believe Ethan hadn't knowingly dragged her into something criminal. But the truth was simpler, brutal, undeniable. She had no idea what Ethan had dragged her into. Grace stepped back and steadied herself. Grace, no, I can't go anywhere with you right now. Detective Lee frowned. Detective Lee, Mrs. Whitmore. Grace raised a hand. Grace, I need time to think. I need to breathe. And I'm not moving until I talk to Ethan. Detective Harris studied her, then gave the smallest nod. Detective Harris, you have 1 hour. We'll be close. The detectives left her with a card and got back into their sedan, parking across the street with headlights off, waiting like silent guardians or silent threats. Grace couldn't tell which. She pulled out her phone, hesitating, then dialed Ethan. He answered on the first ring. Ethan, Grace? Thank God. Listen, Grace, Ethan, tell me the truth. What did you get me involved in? There was no hesitation on Ethan's side, no denial, no deflection, just a heavy, tired silence. Ethan, where are you? Grace, answer me. Ethan exhaled shakily. Ethan, Grace, I can explain everything, but not over the phone. Grace closed her eyes. Grace, so there is something to explain. Ethan, meet me, please. Grace, why shouldn't I go to the police right now? Ethan, because you'll be handing yourself over as a witness to something you don't understand yet, and they won't protect you from the people who set this up. Grace's breath hitched. Grace, who set what up? Ethan's voice hardened. Ethan, someone on my board wants me out. They forged signatures. They manipulated accounts. They used Maddie to gather intel on you. And now they want to use you to destroy me. Grace's voice trembled with anger. Grace, I wouldn't be usable if you hadn't lied to me. Ethan fell silent. Then quietly, Ethan, you're right. For the first time, his voice was stripped of charm, strategy, and ego. He sounded human, frightened, small. Ethan, Grace, meet me at our house in the Hamptons. Please, just you and me. I need to show you something. Grace stiffened. Grace, I'm not coming alone. Ethan's tone sharpened. Ethan, you have to. If anyone sees you go there, everything I tell you will become evidence in an open investigation. Grace, oh, and we wouldn't want that, right? Ethan, Grace, please, I'm begging you. Grace stood at the edge of the sidewalk, the cold wind slashing through her hair. The detective's car idled quietly in the distance. Her marriage, her reputation, her freedom, her sanity, all hung in the balance. This wasn't just a failing relationship. This wasn't just betrayal. This wasn't even about infidelity anymore. This was survival. Grace whispered into the phone. Grace, fine, I'll go. Ethan exhaled in relief. But Grace finished. Grace, but you won't be the only one with secrets tonight. She hung up, straightened her coat, and took one step into the night. Because if she was going down, she wasn't going down quietly. She was going down fighting. The drive to the Hamptons felt longer than usual, even though Grace Whitmore barely remembered the route. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The night sky stretched over the highway, moonlight flickering across the windshield as if urging her forward into something she could never undo. Grace murmured to herself, "Grace, do not brake, not yet." Her phone buzzed once. A text from the detectives. A Detective Lee. "We strongly advise you to avoid isolated areas." Grace ignored it. Another message popped up. "Maddie. Grace, please. We need to talk." Grace silenced the phone and focused on the road ahead. Tonight was not about Maddie, not about the detectives, not about the board or the pregnant woman or the lies woven like a net around her. Tonight was about Ethan. And the truth, scene change. Whitmore Hampton's estate. The house looked different at night, haunting, quiet, emptied of warmth. Grace stepped out of the car and pulled her coat close. The gravel crunched under her heels as she made her way toward the front door. Inside, dim lights glowed across the foyer. Ethan stood near the fireplace, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. He looked less like the billionaire CEO and more like a man whose world was collapsing. The second he saw her, he moved forward. "Ethan." "Grace, thank you for coming." Grace held up a hand. "Grace, don't touch me. Don't hug me. Don't pretend this is something it isn't." He stopped instantly. "Ethan." "Okay. Okay, I deserve that." He gestured toward the living room. "Ethan, can we sit?" Grace, "No, say what you need to say." Ethan swallowed hard. He went to a drawer, pulled out a thick envelope, and set it on the coffee table. Grace eyed it with distrust. "Grace, what is that?" Ethan, "Proof." Grace frowned. "Grace, of what?" Ethan, "That someone on the board is framing me and using you as collateral damage. Grace, please listen before you walk out." Grace hesitated, not because she trusted him, but because something inside her needed clarity, needed answers, even if it hurt. Ethan took a breath, grounding himself. "Ethan, 2 years ago, a new investor group joined the board. They wanted control, fast. They wanted me out because I refused to sell intellectual assets to a foreign tech conglomerate." Grace, "And what does that have to do with me?" Ethan, "Everything, because they realized something. I'd do anything to protect you. Anything." Grace felt something twist in her chest, something like grief, something like anger. Ethan continued. "Ethan, they forged your signature on offshore documents. They manipulated internal transfers to make it look like I was hiding money. They paid Maddie to spy on you. Grace, everything you've seen, every rumor, every leak, it was orchestrated." Grace shook her head slowly. "Grace, you keep blaming everyone but yourself. What about the woman? The photos? The touching? The pregnancy?" Ethan closed his eyes. "Ethan, that is the part I cannot spin. I messed up. I crossed lines. I broke your trust. But the pregnancy claim, it is fake, and I can prove it." He slid another paper toward her. "Ethan, she tried to blackmail me last year. When I refused, she joined the board faction to help take me down." Grace picked up the document with trembling fingers. It was a legal letter, a paternity demand, stamped, processed, and withdrawn. She withdrew it? Ethan nodded. "Ethan, when they realized they couldn't use her story publicly without exposing their scheme." Grace set the paper down and stepped back, feeling dizzy. "Grace, so you're telling me I've been manipulated by the board, betrayed by Maddie, hunted by investigators, all because they want control of the company?" Ethan, "Yes, and because I made myself vulnerable by being an idiot." A bitter laugh escaped Grace. "Grace, that part at least is true." Ethan bowed his head. "Ethan, I deserve it." Grace paced in slow, controlled steps. Every truth he revealed only sharpened the jagged edges in her chest. "Grace, you didn't just lie to me, Ethan. You used me. You put my name on dangerous documents. You let me sleep next to you while you were being hunted by corporations." Ethan, "I know, and I'm sorry. But Grace, if we don't act now, they will come after you. Not just me." Grace froze. "Grace, what do you mean?" Ethan stepped closer, not touching her, but lowering his voice. "Ethan, you were the one who notarized the shell account paperwork. They can claim you were involved. Grace's heart dropped into a cold pit. Grace, you told me it was for privacy protection. Ethan, I know, and I lied, and I shouldn't have, and I am going to fix it. Grace's voice cracked. Grace, how? Ethan reached for the envelope. Ethan, by giving this to the investigators myself, by confessing, by protecting you. Grace stared at him, in shock, in disbelief, in something else she wasn't ready to name. Ethan's eyes softened with raw sincerity. Ethan, I will take the fall if I have to. I'll resign. I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes. But I need you to know something before I do. Grace held her breath. Ethan, I never stopped loving you. Not for a single second. Grace's throat tightened painfully. She whispered, Grace, it doesn't matter. Ethan nodded slowly. Ethan, I know, but I needed you to hear it. A heavy silence settled between them. Grace finally spoke, voice barely audible. Grace, what happens now? Ethan, now we run. Grace stiffened. Grace, what? Ethan, not from the law, from the people trying to destroy you. Grace, they know about the detectives meeting you. They know you're off script. They may come for you before sunrise. Grace felt a tremor ripple through her. Ethan stepped closer, this time with urgency. Ethan, we need to get somewhere safe, somewhere no one can track us. Grace narrowed her eyes. Grace, you mean together? Ethan, yes. Grace, why would I go anywhere with you? Ethan, because whether you believe me or not, your life is in danger. Grace opened her mouth to argue, but headlights flared through the front windows, bright, fast, and familiar. A car pulled into the driveway, then another. Ethan's face drained of color. Ethan, they found us. Grace turned toward the window. Men stepped out of the vehicles. Not detectives, not board members, private security, armed, unmarked. Grace whispered, Grace, oh God. Ethan grabbed her hand. Ethan, Grace, listen to me. If we don't leave now. A loud metallic crash shook the front gate. Ethan's voice rose in panic. Ethan, we have to run, now. The front door rattled violently. Shouts echoed outside. Boots pounded against the porch. Grace froze, until Ethan pulled her toward the back exit. Ethan, Grace, please, move. And in that moment, despite everything he had done to her, despite the heartbreak, the betrayal, the lies, Grace realized one truth. If she did not run, she would not survive the night. The back door slammed behind them as Ethan dragged Grace across the patio. Cold wind whipped across the lawn, carrying the sound of men shouting at the front of the house. Flashlights slashed through the windows. Gravel crunched. Metal clanged. Everything that followed felt like a nightmare Grace had no control over. Ethan whispered sharply, Ethan, stay low, stay close. Grace tightened her coat, her breath shaking in the icy air. Grace, where are we going? Ethan, the shed. There's an exit through the back gate. Grace Bouvin. You have a back gate? Ethan, everyone in my world has one. A dark, bitter part of Grace almost laughed. Of course he did. They dashed across the yard. Grace's shoes slipped in the grass, but Ethan steadied. Behind them, a window shattered, followed by shouting. Man's voice. Front is clear. Check the back. Grace gasped. Grace. They're coming. Ethan. I'm in no. Keep moving. The shed sat near the far corner of the property, a small wooden building painted white, appearing harmless, except for the reinforced door and steel lock. Ethan punched in a code, shoved the door open, and pulled Grace inside. He closed it quietly, not slamming, just enough to click into place. The interior was dark until Ethan flicked a switch. Grace blinked. It wasn't a shed. It was a fully equipped security room. Multiple screens, a power generator, a backup satellite phone, a cabinet with emergency supplies, a floor panel that looked suspiciously like a trap door. Grace stared at Ethan. Grace, what is this? Ethan, a contingency plan for situations like this. Grace scoffed. Grace, you mean when your life explodes because of all the secrets you keep? Ethan didn't deny it. He started pulling items from a shelf. Ethan, we have less than a minute. Help me. Grace stood still. Grace, no, I'm done running blindly behind you. Tell me what's going on. Ethan froze, just long enough to make her regret asking. He turned slowly. Ethan, they're not here to kill me. They're here to take you. Grace's knees weakened. Grace, what? Why would they take me? Ethan, because you're the easiest leverage point. I wouldn't give up infinite tech for anything, but I'd give up everything for you. They know that. Grace whispered. Grace, oh God. Ethan, they want you alive, not hurt, just controlled. Grace, that isn't comforting. Ethan, it's the truth. Heavy boots thudded on the lawn outside. Voices called orders. Flashlights washed over the shed walls. Grace backed away from the door. Grace, this is insane. All of it. I should have stayed with the detectives. Ethan spun toward her. Ethan, they can't protect you, not from a private security force with board-level funding. Grace, so what's your plan? Hide in your apocalypse bunker? Ethan didn't smile. He pointed to the trap door. Ethan, that leads to a service tunnel. It ends in an old maintenance road. If we reach it before they search the backyard, we can escape. Grace folded her arms. Grace, and then what? We run forever? Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft but urgent. Ethan, no, we run long enough to clear your name. Something in his tone, raw, earnest, terrified, reached a part of Grace she didn't want to acknowledge. But the moment didn't have time to bloom. A loud bang slammed against the shed door. Man's voice, check this building! Grace's breath hitched. Ethan grabbed her hand. Ethan. Grace, please, trust me one more time. She stared at him. For all the lies, for all the betrayals, for all the wounds. Trusting him now felt like walking into fire. But not trusting him felt like walking into a bullet. Grace whispered, Grace, fine, but if you're lying, Ethan, I'm not. The pounding on the door grew louder. Ethan yanked open the trap door. A cool, musty draft rushed out. A narrow ladder led downward into the dark. Without hesitation, Ethan climbed down first. Grace hesitated only a second, then descended into the darkness. Just as her feet touched the ground below, the shed door burst open above them. Voices roared, flashlights beamed, Grace gasped. Ethan slammed the trap door shut, plunging them into darkness. Grace grabbed his arm. Grace, we're trapped, Ethan. No, we're hidden. Above them, men stomped around. Footsteps thundered. Something metal crashed to the floor. Man's voice, nothing here. Another voice, move to the east lawn. She has to be nearby. Their footsteps faded. Silence returned. Grace leaned against the dirt wall, trembling. Ethan used his phone as a flashlight. Ethan, come on, we're safe for now. Grace followed him through the narrow tunnel. The air smelled of soil and old wood. The only sound was their quick, uneven breathing and the faint echo of pursuit somewhere far above them. After several minutes, they reached the end, a steel door. Ethan pushed it open, revealing a moonlit clearing behind the property, a forgotten maintenance road leading deeper into the trees. Ethan inhaled sharply. Ethan, we made it. Grace collapsed against the doorway. Grace, I don't know how much more of this I can take. Ethan turned to her, guilt heavy in his eyes. Ethan, you shouldn't have had to take any of it. Grace laughed, bitter and broken. Grace, that doesn't undo anything. Ethan nodded. Ethan, I know, but I swear to you, Grace, I will fix this. Grace looked at him, really looked. For the first time, she saw a man who wasn't powerful, or charming, or invincible. He was scared, fallible, desperate to protect her, and maybe trying to redeem himself. Grace, where do we go now? Ethan handed her a backpack. Ethan, there's a safe house 2 miles down the trail. Grace raised an eyebrow. Grace, you have a safe house too, of course you do. Ethan actually laughed, a tired, miserable sound. Ethan, you're funny when you're terrified. Grace, and you're honest when you're cornered. A beat, then another sound drifted toward them. Engines, multiple vehicles, coming closer. Grace's pulse surged. Grace, Ethan. Ethan grabbed her hand again. Ethan, we run, now. So they did, through the trees, down the road, toward a future that might save them or destroy them. Either way, Grace Whitmore wasn't weak anymore. She wasn't clueless. She wasn't a pawn. She was awake. She was angry. She was done being used. And she was ready for whatever came next. Grace Whitmore had never run this far or this fast in her life. The forest path felt endless, moonlight flickering through the skeletal branches overhead as her breath came out in sharp clouds. Ethan kept pace beside her, occasionally glancing back to check the darkness behind them. The hum of engines faded, but not enough to bring safety, only a fragile pocket of silence. Grace finally slowed, leaning against a tree, chest heaving. Grace. Ethan. Stop, please. Ethan halted instantly, placing a steadying hand near her shoulder, but not touching her without consent. Ethan, we can rest for 2 minutes, no more. Grace pushed hair out of her face, her voice unsteady but sharp. Grace. Explain the safe house. Explain everything. I won't keep running without answers. Ethan hesitated. Moonlight cast sharp lines across his face. Fear, guilt, exhaustion, all stitched together. Ethan, the safe house is a property under an associate's name. Someone I trust, someone the board can't track. Grace narrowed her eyes. Grace, and who is that? Ethan exhaled. Ethan, Adam Price. Grace stiffened. Adam Price, Ethan's former partner, the one he had supposedly parted ways with due to creative differences. A man she had met exactly twice, both times sensing an air of secrecy around him. Grace, I thought you and Adam cut ties. Ethan, we did, publicly, privately. He's the only person on the inside who isn't trying to destroy me. Grace did not soften. Grace, so you trusted him but not me? Ethan closed his eyes. Ethan, I trusted the wrong people, Grace, and I lied to the one person I should have protected. Grace didn't respond. She pushed off the tree and resumed walking. Ethan followed, keeping a respectful distance. They walked for several minutes in silence, the path widening into an open clearing. A faint glow appeared ahead, a small cabin nestled between two large oaks. Grace slowed. Grace, that's it? Ethan, yes. The cabin looked unassuming, almost peaceful. Light spilled from a single window, warm and inviting, shockingly out of place given the chaos of the night. Ethan approached first, but Grace grabbed his arm. Grace, wait, how do you know it's safe? Ethan softened. Ethan, I don't, not completely, but Adam said he'd activate the safe house tonight, and there's a signal he always leaves when it's clear. Grace, what signal? Ethan pointed toward the porch. A small lantern hung by the door, glowing faint blue. Ethan, that. Grace approached the steps cautiously. The air shifted, warmth from the lantern brushing against her skin. The cabin door opened before she could knock. A man stepped out. Tall, sharp features, dark hair streaked with early gray. Eyes that mapped the world in seconds. Adam Price. Adam. You took your time. Ethan. We were followed. Adam's eyes flicked to Grace, studying her without judgment. Adam. You must be exhausted. Come inside, both of you. Grace hesitated. Grace. I don't know if I trust you. Adam gave a mild, humorless smile. Adam. Good. That means you're still thinking clearly. He stepped aside, letting them enter, inside the safe house. The interior felt strangely normal. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small dining table, mismatched chairs. Not the panic bunker she expected. Grace sank into a chair, her legs finally giving up. Ethan paced anxiously. Adam poured water into cups and set them on the table. Adam, drink. You'll need it. Grace took a sip, hands trembling. Grace. Someone tried to take me. Not Ethan, not Maddie, someone else. Why me? Why? Adam leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Adam. Because you're the cleanest part of Ethan's life. Ethan nodded grimly. Ethan. She's the one thing they can use to break me. Adam continued. Adam. The board faction wants Ethan out, but they don't want a legal fight. They don't want media scandals. They want something simple. Pressure. He gestured toward Grace. Adam. And you are the perfect pressure point. Grace clenched her jaw. Grace. What do they plan to do? Kidnap me? Blackmail me? Threaten me? Adam's tone was calm but deadly serious. Adam, they want you to sign a statement saying you helped Ethan move money offshore. If they get that, they can remove him without a corporate war. Grace's blood ran cold. Grace, they want to frame me. Adam, no, they want to rake Ethan. Grace pressed a trembling hand against her forehead. Grace, and the detectives? Ethan answered quietly. Ethan, some of them are legitimate, some may be compromised. We don't know which. That's why meeting them alone is dangerous. Grace felt sick. Grace, so tonight, everything I thought was real wasn't. Adam shook his head. Adam, no, Ethan is a fool with a God complex, but his love for you, that part is painfully real. Grace closed her eyes, grounding herself in breath. Grace, I don't care about love right now. I want the truth. Adam nodded. Adam, then let's start with the three biggest lies. Grace lifted her head sharply. Grace, 3? Adam held up a finger. Adam, 1. The offshore documents with your signature were forged. Grace gasped. Ethan, I swear, Grace, I didn't know they used your name. Adam raised a second finger. Adam, 2. The so-called pregnant woman is part of the faction. She was never involved with Ethan beyond stage photos. Grace stared at Ethan. He nodded slowly. Ethan, I never slept with her. I swear on everything. Adam raised a third finger. Adam, and 3, Maddie wasn't the mastermind. Grace's heart nearly stopped. Grace, what? Adam spoke carefully. Adam, Maddie was manipulated. She thought she was protecting you. She had no idea what she was feeding into. Grace whispered. Grace, but she betrayed me. Adam, yes, but she wasn't the architect. Grace's stomach clenched, torn between rage and reluctant understanding. Ethan sat beside her, voice trembling. Ethan, Grace, the real architect, wants you to crumble. They want you scared. They want you isolated. Adam finished the thought. Adam, they want you to give up. Grace looked between them. Grace, but why me? I'm not part of the company. Adam gave her a look both gentle and devastating. Adam, you are the only thing Ethan loves more than power. And that makes you the most dangerous piece on the board. Grace felt the truth strike her like a physical blow. Not weak, not incidental, not collateral. She mattered, which meant she had power. Grace straightened, wiping her face. Grace, what do we do now? Adam exchanged a glance with Ethan. Adam, now we hit back. Grace, how? Adam smiled in a way that made her nervous. Adam, we expose the faction, we expose their forgery, we expose everything. Ethan nodded. Ethan, and we do it together. Grace hesitated. Grace, I don't know if I can trust you. Either of you. Ethan's voice cracked. Raw. Ethan, then trust yourself and trust the truth. Grace inhaled deeply. Grace, fine, but this time I lead. No more secrets. No more lies. Adam nodded with approval. Ethan looked humbled, grateful, scared. Grace continued. Grace, tomorrow, we bring everything into the light. Adam's smile widened. Adam, be careful, Grace. Once you shine light, you can't unsee what shows up. She didn't flinch. Grace, good, I'm done in living in the dark. And for the first time all night, Grace Whitmore didn't feel powerless. She felt dangerous. Chapter 10. The day the shadows broke, sunrise bled across the sky in muted streaks of pink and gold, casting soft light over the safe-house cabin. Grace Whitmore had not slept. Neither had Ethan or Adam. The long wooden table was now covered in evidence, documents, forged signatures, time-stamped messages, hidden camera screenshots, and a single flash drive Adam insisted was the detonator. Grace rubbed her temples, whispering to herself, Grace Vanessa, this ends today. Ethan watched her quietly, guilt etched into every line of his face. Adam paced, already calculating the corporate battlefield they were about to step into. Adam, Grace, once we do this, there's no going back. Grace didn't hesitate. Grace, I don't want to go back, preparing the counterattack. Adam spread blueprints across the table, corporate flowcharts, financial trails, timestamps. Adam, The board's faction needed one thing, a believable narrative that Ethan siphoned money offshore with your help. They forged documents linking your signature to shell companies. They orchestrated leaks. They manipulated Maddie, and they nearly took you last night. Grace clenched her jaw. Grace, so we destroy their narrative. Adam nodded. Adam, exactly, but we don't go to the investigators yet. Grace frowned. Grace, why not? Adam, because some of them are compromised. If we go through official channels first, all evidence disappears by morning. We need the public, the investors, the press, a live moment they can't erase. Ethan exhaled sharply. Ethan, Grace, this will put you in the spotlight in a way you've never been. Grace looked at him with a strength he didn't recognize. Grace, then I'll shine. Adam smirked with admiration. Adam, told you she's the dangerous one. The broadcast. By mid-morning, they were on the road. Adam drove. Grace sat in the passenger seat, Ethan behind her. They were heading toward the one location no one would expect, Infinitech headquarters, the heart of the battlefield. Grace glanced at Ethan. Grace, you're handing over your entire career for this. Ethan's reply was quiet. Ethan, I'm handing over my ego. My career wasn't worth losing you. Grace didn't respond, but something soft flickered behind her eyes. Adam cleared his throat. Adam, let's keep the emotional epiphanies to a minimum until we dethrone the villains, okay? Grace actually laughed. Grace, I needed that. Humor, subtle, shaky, but real. And for the first time in days, Grace felt a slice of oxygen enter her lungs. Infinitech lobby. They entered the gleaming marble lobby of Infinitech. Employees buzzed around, unaware of the storm barreling toward them. Adam led them toward the conference center, where a scheduled investor meeting was already underway. Cameras, press, board members, perfect. Grace's pulse thundered. Adam whispered, Adam, you ready? Grace inhaled deeply. Grace, I'm ready. Ethan pushed the double doors open. The room fell silent. At least 50 people turned toward them. Board members, investors, journalists, analysts. The board faction sat in the center row, eyes widening in recognition and fear. Grace stepped forward. Her voice echoed through the room. Grace, I need your attention. A hush rippled across the space. Cameras swung toward her. Ethan stood behind her, Adam at her side. But Grace commanded the entire room with a single breath. Grace, my name is Grace Whitmore, and I'm here because my husband's company has been infiltrated by a faction willing to destroy innocent lives for control. A wave of murmurs. Board members leaned forward. The faction visibly stiffened. Grace continued, voice steady. Grace, I was targeted, manipulated, used as a pawn in a forged financial scheme designed to oust Ethan Whitmore. She held up several documents. Grace, these signatures are not mine. These transfers were fabricated, and the people responsible are sitting in this room. A camera zoomed in. Reporters whispered. Shock spread like fire. One of the faction leaders, Victoria Harlow, shot to his feet. Victoria, this is outrageous. You have no evidence. Adam interrupted, his voice cool. Adam, oh, but we do. He placed the flash drive into the presentation console. Screens lit up with damning proof. Emails, account logs, drafts of forged documents, phone recordings, a meeting transcript implicating Victoria and his allies. Gasps erupted. Ethan watched with a mixture of horror and relief as the truth finally surfaced. Victoria stumbled back, face draining of color. Victoria, this is impossible. This is doctored. Adam, actually it's time-stamped, server logged, and already backed up on 3 independent networks. Try to erase it. Another board member tried to stand, but Grace raised her voice, cutting through the chaos. Grace, you tried to silence Ethan by targeting me. You tried to frame me. You tried to kidnap me, and you failed. Silence. Grace's next words hit like steel. Grace, I am not weak. I am not scared, and I will not be used again. The room erupted, journalists shouting questions, cameras flashing, board members shouting accusations at each other. The faction collapsed under their own panic. But Grace stood still, the calm center of the storm. Aftermath. Authorities swarmed the building within hours. Victoria Harlow was detained on charges of conspiracy, corporate espionage, attempted kidnapping, and fraud. News outlets scrambled to broadcast the story. Victoria Harlow arrested in corporate revenge plot. Former federal prosecutor accused of framing billionaire's wife. Grace Whitmore exposes decade-long conspiracy. By evening, the world had changed. Grace walked out of headquarters with Adam and Ethan beside her. The sun was setting, a quiet gold washing over the city. Adam stopped at the curb. "Adam, this is where I leave you two. My work's done." Grace smiled faintly. "Grace, thank you, Adam, for everything." Adam shrugged. "Adam, just don't make me do this again." He walked off, calm, casual, like he hadn't just dismantled a criminal conspiracy before lunch. Grace and Ethan stood alone on the sidewalk for the first time since their world fell apart. Ethan spoke first. "Ethan, Grace, I know this doesn't fix what I broke." Grace folded her arms. "Grace, no, it doesn't." Ethan nodded slowly. "Ethan, but I want to rebuild at your pace with your rules, not because I deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve someone who fights for you the right way." Grace studied him, not the powerful CEO, not the reckless man she'd married, but someone humbled, someone changed, someone trying. "Grace, I'm not ready to come home." Ethan nodded. "Ethan, I figured." "Grace, but I'm willing to see if we can start again. Slowly, with Dr. Morrison's couples therapy, twice a week. And if you lie once, just once, this time I will burn everything to the ground." Ethan almost smiled. "Ethan, understood." Grace took a long breath. "Grace, Ethan, today wasn't about saving your company." "Ethan, I know." "Grace, it was about saving me." Ethan's voice cracked. "Ethan, I know that too." They stood together as the sky shifted to twilight. Not touching, not rushing, just breathing the same air without fear. Grace finally whispered, "Grace, I'm stronger now." "Ethan, you always were." 6 months later, the podcast studio was smaller than her old penthouse office, but it felt like hers in a way nothing else ever had. Grace Whitmore sat behind the microphone, headphones on, looking at the screen that showed 15,000 live listeners tuning in. "Grace, welcome back to Unbreakable. I'm Grace Whitmore, and today we're talking about something I know intimately, how to survive when the people closest to you turn your world into a battlefield." She glanced through the glass door at the nursery down the hall, where her daughter Emma slept peacefully in her crib. "Grace, some of you asked if I stayed with Ethan. The answer is, I'm trying. We're in therapy. We have boundaries. And he's learning what it means to be accountable instead of charming." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Grace, Ethan resigned as CEO. He works from home now, consults. He's learning to be present, not powerful. Honest, not strategic. Is it perfect? No. Do I trust him completely? Not yet, but I trust myself, and that's what matters." A soft knock at the door. Ethan appeared holding a coffee mug. He mouthed, "You okay?" She nodded. He left quietly. Grace continued. "Grace, Victoria Harlow got 8 years in federal prison. Her accomplices took plea deals. Lauren disappeared to Europe. Maddie's under investigation. We don't speak anymore. And me?" She looked at the camera, her eyes steady and clear. "Grace, I rebuilt. I started this podcast. I published a book about surviving manipulation. I teach women how to recognize predators before they strike. And I'm raising my daughter to be the kind of woman who never apologizes for being strong." She smiled. "Grace, someone once told me that freedom isn't the absence of danger. It's the presence of choice. I choose to stay. I choose to heal. I choose to fight. And if tomorrow I choose differently, that's okay too. Because the woman who walked into that boardroom and burned it all down, she's not going anywhere." She leaned closer to the mic. Grace Whitmore is here to stay. And if you're listening to this because your world just fell apart, you're going to stay too. You're going to survive. You're going to thrive. And one day you'll tell your story just like I'm telling mine." She hit the stop button. The light went red. She removed her headphones and looked out at Manhattan's skyline through her studio window. The city that almost destroyed her. Now her kingdom. Grace whispered to herself, a promise, a reminder, a truth. Grace, I am not the woman I was 6 months ago. I am not the woman I'll be in 6 months. But right now, I am exactly who I need to be. She stood, stretched, and walked to the nursery to check on Emma. Her daughter, her future, her reason for everything. Grace picked up Emma gently, cradling her close. Grace softly, your mama fought for you, and she'll teach you to fight for yourself. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon. The world turned. And Grace Whitmore, survivor, fighter, mother, truth teller, breathed deeply and chose once again to keep going. Because the truth didn't destroy her. It rebuilt her, and whatever came next, healing, rebuilding, or walking away, Grace Whitmore would choose it on her own terms. Hopeful, powerful, and free. The end.